Good evening. My name is Jason Riley, and I'm a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute. And I want to welcome everyone to tonight's discussion of Glenn Loury's fantastic new memoir, which is titled Late Admissions, Confessions of a Black Conservative. Joining us is the author himself, Glenn Loury, a professor of economics at Brown University and the host of a very popular podcast that I regularly tune into, The Glenn Show. Also joining us is Gerald Early, a professor of English and African American Studies at Washington University in St. Louis, where he's taught for more than 40 years and written not only widely, but extremely thoughtfully on race relations and culture and music and sports and Black history and other topics. Professor Early is also the editor of a Washington University publication titled The Common Reader, which I highly, highly recommend checking out. The format tonight will be to begin with a discussion among the three of us for about 40 or 45 minutes or so, and then round out the hour with a few questions from the audience, which can be submitted via Slido or the YouTube comments. And so with that, let's get things started. Professor Loury, this book has gotten a lot of attention for its openness about your personal shortcomings in the past, substance abuse, adultery, run-ins with the police, and so forth. That's been the focus of the reviews I've read and the interviews with you that I've listened to in the past few weeks. I guess you don't mind that, or you wouldn't have included so much detail. But I also think the book has plenty to say about social policies in the U.S. that have been aimed at helping Black people. And given that this discussion is being hosted by the Manhattan Institute for Policy Research, I was hoping to focus on how your upbringing and personal history have influenced your views of those public policies, influenced your development as a public intellectual. The subtitle of the book is Confessions of a Black Conservative. So I guess we could start there. What makes someone who is Black a conservative? Is there agreed upon definition? And why is it that you so self-describe?
Okay, there was just a little bit of interruption in the transmission, so I'm not sure I got the full question. You asked me what makes someone a Black conservative, and you're interested in how my upbringing and background have influenced my views about policy. And I'll try to be concise since we have limited time. So I was trained as an economist in the neoclassical tradition and have a lot of respect for capitalism, open markets, prices, resource allocation by the private sector, and so forth. That inclines me to be friendly to some kinds of conservative and libertarian oriented thinking about economic and social policy. I have had a period in my life where I was exposed to religion, was enraptured by my quest for a relationship with the Almighty, and evolved some ideas and attitudes that were on the cultural issues, on the questions of the family and so on sexuality and so on, were somewhat conservative, at least were friendly to conservative thinking. But I think the main thing that leads me to call myself a Black conservative is that I take a approach to the problem, what I think is existential problem confronting African Americans in the aftermath of the success of the civil rights movement, of emphasizing development and self-reliance and the need for African Americans to step up and take responsibility for our families and our communities. And that is a relatively conservative posture for an African American public intellectual to take. Am I responding to you, Jason?
Yeah. I think that does do a good job of covering what I was getting at. You mentioning both the social conservatism, where that sort of came from, as well as the interest in markets and empiricism and research and data and so forth. Professor Early, does that does that description of conservatism or Black conservatism, has that held up over the decades? Is that still a pretty good working definition of a Black conservative in the 21st century, or has it changed what it means to be a Black conservative?
Well, I think what Professor Loury was saying, yeah, I think that certainly does describe a certain Black conservative and a certain position, but Black conservatism is probably a wider, even wider than just markets or strictly kind of technical meanings about the economy. I think it also has to do with people's certain kind of attitudes that people have. Professor Loury touched upon that with certain kind of things about family and so forth, which I think you find among Black people, and I think also the religion and particular preoccupation with religion and religious expression, the religious life, piety, a certain kind of religious piety, and so forth. So I would say that constellation of things, yeah, I think would be a pretty good, a very good actually assessment of the conservative, by and large, of the Black conservative. Yeah.
Just a quick follow-up, Professor. Does it still have Black conservatism, or does it still have the same stigma today that it has carried in the past, or has that softened somewhat? Is there still as much of a reluctance to? I heard Professor Loury in a maybe on the Glenn show talking about this when he was going over the titles with the publisher, and I believe, Professor Loury, you had said, I insisted on that subtitle. I wanted Black conservative in there, and maybe you could talk about why you wanted that. But I just wanted to get Professor Early's response to does it still carry the same sort of stigmas? In my experience, there have been a lot of people who hold these views, but are reluctant to accept that label. And I'm wondering if that's still the case.
I still sense that it is, at least in the circle that I'm in. I still sense very much that it is with the university intellectual community. Yeah, I would say that there's a stigma attached to it, and most people are hostile to it to some degree, or they certainly don't agree with it. And it fails for the liberal and leftist Black person. It fails on two levels insofar as dealing with the Black conservative. I think it was Lionel Trilling who said that the 20th century was going to be defined by people's quest for authenticity and their expression of sincerity. And the two things that the Black conservative is constantly condemned for is being, one, insincere, and two, inauthentic. And I think that remains consistent. That has remained consistent from the time I was quite young in the profession to now, that criticism has remained the same. And so it becomes a deeper criticism than just a political position. It becomes a deeper criticism about the nature of the person, the nature that your being as a Black person. And I think that's what makes the criticism so profound. I don't mean profound in the sense that it's brilliant. I mean profound just in the sense of the intensity of it with some people, that it has, the criticism can be quite intense.
Can I just interject, Jason? Because this is one of the things that really ticked me off in recounting some of the events in my life, which was the assumption of inauthenticity attached to a person like myself, attached to me individually, for simply thinking my own thoughts about what it is I think Black people should do. And you asked how my background had influenced some of my politics. And I think one theme there definitely is the sense that coming up, I was a father at quite a young age. I was working a full-time job while I was going to college full-time and married with 2 kids. I came up the hard way. felt my authenticity ought not ever to be questioned as an African American. I knew something about the streets. I knew something about the housing projects. I had been in the state penitentiary to visit relatives, friends of relatives, and so on and so forth. And don't tell me I'm not as Black as you are, because I have a different view than you do about this or that question of social policy. And besides, some of the people who are most celebrated as authentic African Americans, Malcolm X, for example, the movement, the Nation of Islam, of which he was a part, were very conservative along some of the very same dimensions that I assert my own conservatism, namely, Black people don't need to be sitting around waiting for white people to come to their rescue. We need to build our own, we need to have our own, we need to take care of our own business. That's a conservative thought, and it's certainly an authentic African American thought. So I would say that on my behalf.
Well, just to follow up with that, in other words, with you coming to your beliefs through sort of reflection and observation, you recount in the book how you take a job at the University of Michigan, and you and your wife at the time frequently go into Detroit. You're in Ann Arbor, 35 miles away, but you go into Detroit. This is early 80s. I think this is Coleman Young's Detroit, Black mayor. This is John Conyers' Detroit, the congressman, Black congressman, whose district covered Detroit. Lots of crime, lots of poverty. You take note of this, and then you notice that Congressman Conyers wants to hold hearings on police brutality, and you say, What are you doing? What? And you talk about how this sort of starts you questioning some of the priorities of the civil rights leadership, given what they're preoccupied with and what you see happening in the world you live in. Can you talk about how that sort of experience might have influenced your views? In other words, this wasn't someone sitting Glenn Loury down.
Okay, Jason, you froze there, but you were asking me about Detroit, Conyers, and how I reacted to the distance between, on the one hand, what I felt was absolutely imperative in the community, which was addressing effectively the problem of criminal victimization, and on the other hand, what was the political imperative for a Black congressman of a big American city, which was holding hearings on police brutality. And this was the late 70s and the early 80s. Yes, Coleman Young was mayor of Detroit, a Black mayor. And John Conyers, the late Congressman John Conyers, was then a young, up-and-coming member of the Congressional Black Caucus and an outspoken advocate of African-American interests. And this was a period when I was developing a critique of the civil rights narrative, where the opposition to discrimination and the complaints about racism, I was arguing, were not enough. And of course, Conyers' hearings on police brutality, the classic move that a progressive African-American political operative might be expected to make, was a part of the old school civil rights approach. Police were racist, we need to have hearings, we needed legislation to correct that problem. And I'm looking at behavior. I'm looking at the expression of values, attitudes, beliefs, and practices that are destroying or undermining the integrity of address. You're not really going to be getting at the problem. This is not any longer 1955. This is 1980, I wanted to say. And I thought that the approach to the problems needed to be much more directed at the underlying functional deficits that were being manifest by these kinds of behaviors. And police brutality, of course, is not a good thing, but it was also, in my view, then and now, for that matter, not the central problem of public safety confronting people living in big cities, of people of color living in ghetto communities in big cities.
Professor Early, could you share some of your, I believe the two of you around the same age here, and you're, I believe, a product of Philadelphia, which wasn't exactly the Emerald City
No.
in the late
No.
70s and early 80s either.
Yeah.
But so you're looking at a similar situation in terms of large urban inner cities dealing with poverty, dealing with violence, and so forth. What vibes are you picking up? Are you thinking about these things that way at the time, and how the civil rights leadership is responding to them?
Yeah, I think so. I thought one of the things about Glenn's book was that it was capturing a certain moment, which I think in the late 70s and early 80s, that you had people coming up who were looking for another kind of rhetoric, another set of ideas to move Black people forward from what had been set up with the Civil Rights Movement and what the Civil Rights Movement had achieved. And the Civil Rights Movement, of course, was the Civil Rights people were, of course, very possessive of their position and so forth, and didn't particularly want to challenge, and probably were maybe slightly surprised, although probably they shouldn't have been, they were getting a challenge from the right. Yeah, sure, those problems that were occurring in Detroit were also occurring in Philadelphia and so forth. I mean, there were problems about the movement of white ethnics away from the Democratic Party to the Republican Party, moving away to their own kind of conservatism, and the jousting that's going on in cities like Philadelphia over the over ethnics fighting over who's going to control the city, and Black people were part of that, as well as Jews and Italians, the Irish, and so forth. I think that Black people, I think that the conservatives came along and wanted to offer something different and wanted to offer a critique. I was kind of struck by it. And the reason why I was struck by it was because I thought that what Black people really needed, whether you agree with the critique or not, I thought what Black people needed was critique. I mean, I thought what Black people needed was criticism. I thought that criticism was vital to Black people's political maturity. So I was kind of intrigued by what was going on with this rise with Thomas Sowell and the Fairmount Conference and all this other kind of stuff that's going on. It's presenting an alternative. It was just nice, whether you agree with it or not, it was just nice to hear an alternative.
Yeah, yeah. So, Professor Loury, after that, you make those observations about Detroit. I believe you recount an episode in the book where you go back and you sort of start to share some of your reflections with your colleagues in the economics department at Michigan, which is an all-white economics department, and they don't really know how to respond to what you're saying, and the way I read it and the way it was presented in the book, it sounded like these were the early developments of you sort of turning towards public intellectualism. You're reading some publications like the New Republic, the Atlantic. You're seeing how academics can stray outside of their fields of expertise, write general interest pieces, contribute to policy debates, and you have some stuff to say now. And yet your colleagues in the academy, I believe one gentleman pulls you aside and says, you're starting to sound like a conservative. You better.
He meant well, Jason.
He
meant well. He had my interest at heart. This is Frank Stafford, labor economist at Michigan. We're going back 45 years and stuff. But yeah, he said, I can see what you're saying. There's merit in some of your argument, but you need to be careful with this stuff. You're going to end up getting pigeonholed as a politically unacceptable type, the Black conservative economist. You want to follow Tom Sowell off into the wilderness, be careful, is what he said. And besides, I think, deep down, I'm not sure that he accepted the premise of the critique. I'm pretty sure that he, as a good center-left Democrat, thought that the social policy had the answer. We needed a little bit more affirmative action. We needed more vigorous anti-discrimination enforcement. We needed to racism, and there's nothing wrong with that. But I think he was kind of missing my point.
Well, what struck me, and the reason I bring this up is because there does seem to be this caricature of the Black conservative out there as someone who is a puppet of the white conservatives, that they're indoctrinated with certain views, that there's no way they could come to these viewpoints on their own. As Professor Early said, this must be, they're inauthentic, they're insincere. They can't possibly have gotten there organically in any sense. And it sounds like you very much did get there organically through your own observations and reflections on what you saw happening around you, what was working, what wasn't working, and you're reflecting on this as a social scientist. But you got there on your own. And it sounds like people were calling you conservative before you were self-identifying that way.
Yeah, I think that's actually correct. They were warning me, I had like nascent conservatism, latent conservatism is about to break out at any moment. Be careful, like that.
Okay. Well, let's go back a little further then, because both of you are also starting your going through college and starting your professional careers at the beginning or near the beginning of this affirmative action era. This is the late 60s, early 70s. And we're talking here about not the affirmative action that goes beyond simply outreach and into double standards, set-asides, quotas, and so forth. And I found these passages in the book, Professor Loury, fascinating because I'm a little younger than both of you, but it was a reminder of how long Black people have been grappling with these thoughts and ideas about how they're seen, how they're perceived because of these policies. So you're coming out of Northwestern as an undergraduate. You're an excellent student, top of your class. You're getting offers for graduate school from Berkeley, Harvard, MIT, and Chicago. And you talk about how a mentor steers you away from Chicago because that's full of these free market conservatives. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, that was not an affirmative action story. That was a don't be a Black conservative story. And don't go down there and let those guys, the Milton Friedmans and the George Stiglers and the Gary Beckers of the world, convert you into something that we wouldn't recognize. Those were my teachers at Northwestern, who were all Keynesian, kind of center left, democratic political orientation. But my early experience with affirmative action involved coming as a transfer student to Northwestern University on full scholarship from a community college where I had a year of pretty good coursework with good grades and hard courses, calculus and stuff like that. But where I was a college dropout, and I initially went to college and dropped out after in my second year because, my girlfriend got pregnant. I had to go to work, and I wasn't paying that much attention to my studies in the first place. I had a checkered record. They took me in at Northwestern with basically on one of my community college teachers' word as a promising Black kid from the south side of Chicago that they didn't want to overlook. They gave me a full ride. There's no way that was not some kind of affirmative action. And yet it was also my entree into the life of the mind, into the great books, into philosophy and history and literature and politics, studying those things seriously. I was a good bet for an affirmative action program in 1969, 1970. And I'm certainly glad that it was there for me to give me this opportunity. Later in my life, I have different things to say about affirmative action and how it affected me personally. But at that period, when I was coming along, first going to undergraduate college, I think, I was the beneficiary of what I think in retrospect was not just lowering standards, but it was casting a wider net and looking for people that might have otherwise not have gotten a chance.
Well, just
that was 1970.
Right. Just to follow up, where I was going initially with this was that you took the spot at MIT for graduate. You took the offer from MIT, and they had a set-aside program
Oh, I'm sorry.
at the
Yeah.
time. And you talk about whether, in the book, you talk about whether you would have gotten in regardless of that program because you thought, you had a good undergraduate academic record, and
Yeah,
so
I'm
that's
sorry,
where I
Jason.
was going with that.
No,
But
I didn't
back to the
understand it.
undergraduate. Yeah, but back to the undergraduate in affirmative
Yeah.
action. You also talk about other Black students at Northwestern and later at MIT, and they're not like you in many ways. They're more middle class. And a lot of them, you say, frankly, are in over their heads. They're struggling academically. You're not sure if they would be at this school, but for some of these programs that admitted them. I'm wondering if that was the basis for some of your later views when it came to issues like affirmative action and how they impact the intended beneficiaries on some level, or can.
That's part of it. I think it was complicated. I mean, first of all, I was a working class kid who had a job, a full-time job. Often I'd show up on campus after having worked 8 hours the night before in overalls, with a pocket protector on my plaid shirt and whatnot. And the kids who were cruising around in their daddy's cars, or who had the luxury of being able to roll out of bed and come 15 minutes late to class, this was not my world. This was not my life. And I harbored a certain amount of resentment about that. I was very serious once I got myself with my feet on the ground, and I became embedded in the wonder, which was higher education at Northwestern University in 1970, 71, 72. I couldn't get enough of pressed against the candy store window. I was hungry all the time. I was a wide-eyed consumer of Western culture as it had been handed down to me through this great institution. And I found a kind of unseriousness in some of the African Americans with whom I was sharing the campus at that time. And as I say, I did have a chip on my shoulder, but I also had a fierce determination to get the most out of this opportunity that I could get. And I didn't see that my racial identity inhibited me from, wanting to know who Goethe or Thomas Mann or whatever it was, or wanting to read European philosophy. I recounted in the book an incident where I run up to this brother, this African man. I want to talk to him about Friedrich Nietzsche because I just got through reading, Friedrich Nietzsche, and I was all worked up about it. And he's telling me, man, Nietzsche is some dead white man. Well, we don't need to be worried about Friedrich. And I that upset me. About MIT, I want to say this. It's true. I was at the top of my class as a math major when I was an undergraduate at Northwestern, regardless of race or identity. I got admitted to MIT, and I got admitted to Harvard, and I got admitted to Berkeley, and I got admitted to Chicago. But MIT did have a program where, in addition to the 25 or so that they would admit under normal competitive conditions, they had set aside 3 seats for African Americans, and I occupied one of those seats. And I did not know whether or not my presence at MIT was conditional on that special dispensation, or whether or not I would have gotten in on my own merit, regardless of being African American. I didn't know that, and that did matter to me. That was something that I worried about, and I set about trying to prove, and I think successfully, that because I did well at MIT and I was advised by top people, Nobel laureates and so forth. I wrote a dissertation that was very well received. I got jobs at offers at good places when I came out of MIT. I think I proved that I, quote, deserved to be there, close quote, but it was a question at the start. That's true. And as far as people having difficulties, well, actually, there's a pretty good history of Blacks at the MIT economics department in the 1970s and 80s, and written by William Darity, Sandy Darity, the economist at Duke. And I don't remember the exact numbers offhand, but I think more than half of the African Americans who matriculated in the PhD program at MIT in the 70s and 80s under this, the dispensation of this program, did not leave with degrees. So people were struggling. And yes, with me acing stuff at MIT and with other African Americans, some of them having trouble with the academic program because of affirmative action, that created a certain amount of tension between me and some of my fellow African American students over this issue of how do we fit in and where do we belong? Because I was saying, Who's we? Who's we? I mean, we're both black, but I'm doing fine. What's the problem?
Glenn, I wish I knew you 40 years ago. I would have liked to have gotten to know that Glenn Loury. That would have been a treat. Professor Early, you want to respond to anything, add anything to what Glenn's been saying here?
I mean, it's I know very well what he speaks of because I was a college student around this time. His experience in some ways is very similar to what the kind of thing that Clarence Thomas describes in My Grandfather's Son. And Black students were admitted. I was a working class kid myself, and Black students were admitted. And I went to the University of Pennsylvania, and there were many who were admitted, but many of them dropped out, flunked out, and so forth. I guess it's the old saying of many are called and few are chosen. And the problem was, I agree with what Clarence Thomas said in his book about being kind of like a guinea pig with this whole thing with affirmative action. But the other thing I thought was that Black people who came in were insufficiently serious. Many of them were middle-class kids and so forth, and they wouldn't study. I mean, it's not a matter they couldn't study, they wouldn't study. They were playing bid whist and stuff like that. They wouldn't study. And that's, I thought that was, I felt very much like I'm here to get this degree. And I'm going to get this degree in 4 years because the school is expensive. I can't afford to stay any more than 4 years. And I'm going to get this degree and I'm going to get out of here. And I was disappointed with the number of Black kids I was in school with who were not serious about being there. And I felt, as Professor Loury did, that I was being opened up to all this sort of stuff. I mean, I'm reading, the Brothers Karamazov, and I'm reading these plays by Shakespeare and all this sort of stuff, and I'm being opened up to all this sort of stuff. And I said, man, isn't this great? And oh, I'm not even reading this. And it's like, whoa, like, why are you wasting your time here if you're not going to read it? But yeah, I thought it was a tremendous experience. And I think that was the biggest disappointment. The failure was in bringing people in who weren't really prepared for that experience. And I think that was, a problem. But what Professor Loury describes and what Clarence Thomas described is very similar to my own experience at the University of Pennsylvania when Clarence Thomas was at Holy Cross, I believe, and Professor Loury in Northwestern.
Well, Professor Early, so last year the Supreme Court says enough of this, and they issue a decision ending racial preferences in college admissions. I read an essay that you wrote, I believe it was shortly after the decision, about the fallout, the initial fallout. Not enough time had really passed. We've got a year now, so maybe you two can reflect on it. But at the time, you thought it was sort of a muted response among Blacks to the decision, because you said, not a lot of Black people think these policies affect them that much. This was a sliver of the Black community. And you said the Black community has always had a very complicated relationship with racial preferences and affirmative action to begin with. So two questions. One is, you were there along with Professor Loury, sort of at the beginning, at the early stages of this policy that was supposed to increase the ranks of the Black middle class, create more Black professionals, all the rest. And now you're there when the Supreme Court wants to sunset these policies. What's the future hold here? Are these policies going to be missed, or do you say good riddance? Your thoughts?
Well, at the time, well, I think that it's too early to tell. As Cho and Lai once told Henry Kissinger, too soon to tell. But he said that in response when Kissinger asked him about the impact of the French Revolution, and he says too soon to tell. So at any rate, but I do think that the as I said in that piece, that I think Black people have always had kind of mixed feelings about affirmative action, because the Black people I was around, working class Black people and the like, I think they have mixed feelings about someone giving you something on the basis of your race, um, and also because the policies tended to be something that was more interesting to, or more important to, middle class Black people. I remember talking to my barber once, and he had never heard of affirmative action. He had never heard the expression affirmative action. He said, "What is that?" And it was about 10 years ago. And I was just stunned that he had never heard this expression. He didn't know what it was. He had no idea. There are a couple of things. I think one, that many elite colleges will try to work around it. So I think that they will try to do what they've always been doing. And so that's one thing. I think that on the whole, for Black people, insofar as college education goes and stuff like that, I don't think that the change will make that much of a difference. I think that people will still go to college. I said that in the piece. Black people will still go to college, and things will go on. I think that Black people have always felt a tremendous sense of being stigmatized, and I think that's always been the problem with affirmative action, is being stigmatized. And I think that in some ways, if you can do this thing and it lessens you being stigmatized as a Black person, I think it's a good thing. Because
Glenn, I'd like to get your thoughts on that as well. Just on the stigma point, I think of someone like Randall Kennedy. Both of you are familiar with him, law professor at Harvard, written a lot on affirmative action. Says, get over the stigma. So what? I don't mind if there's an asterisk next to my name because I got in because of this, or do they get over it? The good of these policies outweigh the downside and any stigma. So, Glenn, but your thoughts on the same question I asked Professor Early.
Well, and when I think about this, I think about what is in the interest of African Americans, and I think about what's in the interest of the country. And I'm mindful of the fact that we're a half century down the road with affirmative action. You're talking about it in the context of my early career, and I left college in 1972, left graduate school in 19, a half century ago. What's good for Black people? Well, getting in, presumably, all things considered, as Randall Kennedy might say, stigma and all, or as Colin Powell once said, I'll hire a psychiatrist. You could tell me about the stigma. Maybe I'm not good enough. I'll hire a psychiatrist with the extra money I made from being, getting the job or whatever. But that's not the end of the story. I mean, the only reason you need a special consideration in the first place is because as a population, you haven't developed your human potential to be effectively competitive in the way that you should. Affirmative action doesn't actually accomplish that development imperative. It is a substitute for it. And for that reason, I think at the end of the day, it's not a permanent solution for the problem of disparity that African Americans face. But for the country, I mean, it's beyond ironic to me that it was a racial minority population of students who brought the lawsuits that culminated in the Supreme Court's decision last year. Those Asian students are Americans too. They're the future, part of the future immigrants, second generation, third generation of our great country. And there's just a question of whether or not you want, as a permanent matter, to corrupt your institutions of meritocratic assessment on behalf of this remedial social objective. That's just not the way that the country should be going forward as a permanent matter. As a transitory matter, you could make the case. As a permanent matter, I think that case is very hard to make. I think that that's the sum and substance of Justice Roberts' opinion in that case as well. Bad for the country.
Just before we leave the affirmative action debate, I want to go back to something you wrote, Professor Early, after or during the whole Claudine Gay scandal at Harvard. And you said, I believe you said she might have done herself a favor by resigning, and that you thought it was the silver lining for you was sort of, we've made progress if Black people can go through these scandals and they not have the consequences they might have had in the past. Can you
Mhm.
talk a little bit about what you meant by that?
Let me try to remember. Let me try to remember that golden oldie. The I think at the time I wanted to try to take a somewhat different take on Claudine Gay, and there was so much fire about it at the time, and particularly because of the whole thing about, you talk about stigma. Here was something where stigma really affected her because she was attacked for being not qualified to be the president of Harvard. She was attacked for her plagiarism. And Carol Swain came out and said she was not qualified to, she wasn't even qualified to be a good political scientist, and that she had stolen her stuff, some of her ideas from Carol Swain. And so I was trying to think at the time about looking at her, and thinking, okay, this woman has suffered this kind of, she's being, here's where affirmative action has really stigmatized her, and the stigma is really working against her because it really is being simplified. And this is humiliating. I thought it was humiliating for this woman to be going through this and to be said to be not qualified for the job.
Okay.
So my feeling about it was that, okay, she's able to land on her feet. She's able to stay at Harvard. She's able to keep tenure. She's able to stay with the salary that she was getting, which was an extraordinary salary. I mean, she was going to keep the salary that she was getting. I said, wow, that's pretty good for a full professor to get that kind of salary. And I thought that was, yeah, but I thought that was good in the sense that she was able to land on her feet, that you didn't have, with Black people, with something like this happening, a kind of really terribly tragic story, that there was a certain amount, she had a certain amount of leverage, and there was a certain amount of going for her, in the sense that they couldn't just cut her loose entirely and just cut her adrift. And I thought that was important. I thought that was significant that she was able to leverage that, and to leverage her sex and her race in that way, to salvage herself. And I think that was probably the point I was trying to make. I hope I made it better in the piece that I
No,
just
I
made
think
here.
I think no no I think that was the gist of what you were
Right.
getting at. But
But I did think that the whole thing, what bothered me was the power of the stigma, and I think how it really, I felt bad for her because I thought she was really quite humiliated by it all. And I'm not saying that she should have been kept on as president or anything else, but I do think it was terribly humiliating. I'm not saying that she didn't probably in some way contribute to that, maybe by some of the things that she responded to in what was going on. But nonetheless, I felt some kind of sympathy for her, which is why I wrote that piece.
before we go to the questions, I just don't. I want to ask you both one more question, since I have two Black public intellectuals with me this evening, and then that is, I'd like to ask both of you what you think about the current state of Black public intellectualism. Are you encouraged or not by the ascendance of people like Ibram Kendi and Ta-Nehisi Coates and Nicole Hannah-Jones and Jelani Cobb, and I could go on, but you know who I'm talking about, these younger progressives that seem to be really dominating, steering the conversation on race today. Are you hearing anything new? Have you heard it all before? When it comes to the anti-racism, the social justice, the DEI, what do you make of the young guns out there, and what do you see in terms of the direction of these debates going forward? Professor Early, you talked about how you, a long time, 50 years ago, you wanted to see somebody out there challenging the establishment. You thought that a critical assessment of what was going on was necessary and important. Do you see that happening today, to the extent that you'd like to? Why don't we start with Glenn, and then we can go to Professor.
Well, I would distinguish between the journalists like Nicole Hannah-Jones or Ta-Nehisi Coates. I don't mean that pejoratively. I just mean that they don't pretend to have a mastery over a discipline and to be scholarly and deeply rooted in some tradition of inquiry. On the one hand, and the people who are professors of philosophy or history or politics or sociology or economics in good universities around the country who are African-American on the other, I think in that latter register, there are a lot of very talented people and a lot of interesting people. And yes, there's been affirmative action and there's been, racial preference and emphasis on diversity, but there's also been the creation and the production of some scholarship that is of lasting value, and that's pretty serious. On the other hand, I find it, I won't go on long about this, hard to take some of these journalistic public intellectuals very seriously. I don't think they're particularly deep. I think there's a trendiness that goes on. I was not a big fan of the 1619 Project, although you have to say, warts and all, it was a success for what it was. I was not a big fan of Between the World and Me, but again, you have to say, whatever shortcomings I might find in it, it was a commercial success. The booking agents at Bill Maher or whomever are not exactly a tenure and promotion committee at a major university. The standards are not quite the same. So those are some thoughts that I would offer.
Okay. Professor Early?
Well, I think that, I would agree with that. I certainly think that the progressive element is the dominant element that you're going to hear out there right now. And that's because it's kind of an echo chamber, because the museums and the universities and the libraries and the media, all these people come basically out of the same milieu. And so you're going to have this kind of echo chamber where where the progressive thought is going to be valorized in a way, and the conservative thought is going to be seen as aberrant or whatever, because the progressive thought is thought of as being more humane on the whole than conservative thought is. And so that doesn't surprise me. I agree with Professor Loury that there's been some really good scholarship that's been put out. Many of these people are quite impressive in many respects. But when you come out as a public intellectual, as many of them have, and you're on TV and you're doing sound bites, you're doing op-ed things and stuff like that, then in some ways you have to wind up kind of almost caricaturing what you're about, because you're reducing it to a kind of sound bite, or you're reducing it to a kind of cliche. And so that becomes a real problem, I think, in presenting your thought and presenting who you are. So yeah, if you're asking me, have I heard it all before? Yeah, sure. I've heard absolutely all of it before. And I don't mind hearing it again. But yeah, I've heard it all before, sure. Left-wing progressive thinking among Black people. If you go back to Du Bois or Paul Robeson or a bunch of other people, sure, you've heard it all before. It's dressed up a little differently now with critical race theory or DEI or things like that. But sure, it's the anti-American, anti-Western elements in this, and the whole oppressor-oppressed thing element in there, that binary. Even that, well, the binary thing about the oppressed and the oppressor is not new. That's pretty old. And the other stuff is a little bit new and everything, but it's still, I've heard it all before. But I don't get bored with it necessarily. But I would like to hear a greater range of thought out there, because I think that progressive people who are out there giving their opinions need to be challenged more. And I don't think they're necessarily challenged as well as they can be. And I think it would be good for everybody if they were challenged more.
I want to go back to something you wrote in the book, Professor Loury, about in the late 60s, early 70s. Professor Early's talking about this binary, the oppressed, the oppressor. He's talking about Marxism that was so trendy back then. I believe there's a passage in the book where you talk about, yeah, I read Marx. I didn't become a Marxist, but I had a new appreciation of why so many found him persuasive. Why didn't you find him so persuasive, Professor Loury? Why? What was it that prevented you from drinking the Marx Kool-Aid that so many others did? Not only other young people, but particularly young Black radicals, leftists at the time, found so compelling about someone like Marx.
Well, two things really. One of them was Marx is not a particularly incisive economic theorist. I mean, he's a world historic, big philosophical, big think, sweeping theory of history guy, but he's not. If I want to know why is the price of bread high and why is the price of clothing low, or what's going to happen in the housing market, and where are investments going, whatnot, he's just not a very impressive parser of the problem of resource allocation, pricing, and economic, analysis. So I was interested in economic analysis, and I saw that the answer was not in Marx. But the other thing that I think kept me with an appreciation for the intellectual achievements of the Marxian corpus was the 20th century. Looking at what Marxism wrought on the ground in Central America, in Eastern Europe, in Africa, in Asia. And, it was the road to serfdom, as Hayek said. And I thought that was pretty clear. And I was clear about that quite early on in my intellectual career.
Okay. Professor Early, I wanted to get your reaction to that. And in this context, I believe the first conversation we ever had was when I was working on a book about Thomas Sowell, who you mentioned earlier. And you mentioned reading Sowell when you were in graduate school in the early 80s, and having an appreciation, not just at his clear writing ability and so forth, but at that he was bringing an economist mindset to topics about race and inequality that typically were covered by psychologists and sociologists and so forth. And you found that very refreshing. Even if you didn't agree with everything he was saying, you just appreciated that point of view. And I'm wondering if there's something about an economist approaching some of these issues about social inequality and racism and injustice. And does Glenn remind you of what you saw and sort of Sowell's perspective on some of these issues? The empiricism, the results. He says, look at the 20th century. That's your response to Marx. Look at what happened.
Absolutely. I think, because at that stage of my development.
I think we lost your audio.
Oh. You can't hear me?
We can't hear you. We can't hear. I think he can hear us, but we can't hear you.
No, I can't hear you.
Hey, I'm not muted.
There you are.
You just went in and out.
Oh.
Can someone help him out?
Because I'm not muted, so I don't.
Your microphone is still connected to your last headphones, most likely.
Ah, yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
Got it?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we got you. We got you now.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Good. The economist, somebody like Sowell, just opened up a lot of things. There was a certain, with Professor Loury and with somebody like Sowell, I thought there was a certain kind of swagger actually with the writing and with how they approach things, which was kind of cool. But also because most of the stuff in Black studies that I was dealing with at that time, most of the intellectual currents were being in social science. Social science was dominant at that time. Was mostly coming from sociologists and psychologists. Black psychology was a big movement then, so forth. There was big movement with sociology and people like Joyce Ladner and other people like that. So it was very refreshing to get somebody like Soul. But the other thing was that because he was challenging so much that was being said, and it was just good to get the challenge, even when you didn't agree with it. It was just good to get it, and it was just good to hear another kind of perspective coming out that was challenging it. Talking about free markets and all that sort of stuff. And after you've heard so much about how wonderful socialism and communism is, it was sort of, I said, oh, that's kind of interesting. A Black person saying free markets is a good thing. I don't run into that every day. So, I thought that was a good thing.
We have time to take a quick question or a quick answers to the question. But one of the questioners wants to know what the two of you think about the state of the civil rights movement today, where it's headed. Is it too much of an industry? Is it still a grassroots movement? Your assessments of where things stand today. Glenn, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say not in such good shape, frankly, kind of irrelevant. I mean, these are cheap shots. This is easy to say. It kind of absorbed into the Democratic Party. The African American political expression is now an element within the coalition of the Democratic Party. The energy and the civil rights questions are coming from, for example, gender identity stuff and that kind of thing, more so than it is from the racial claims. I think the most influential outcropping of the last 15 years or so has been the Black Lives Matter movement. And, we can see what that came to. I think the accomplishments of that movement pale in comparison to what the classical civil rights movement in the 1990s accomplished. So I'd say not so healthy a civil rights movement understood in terms of racial advocacy here in the first quarter of the 21st century.
Okay. Professor Early?
I would agree, but I put a slightly different take on it. Is that the civil rights movement has succeeded. It's succeeded to the point where it's been thoroughly institutionalized and thoroughly bureaucratized. And so it's so in that respect, it's succeeded. And in that respect, I don't think it is the kind of fresh or innovative movement that it was, let's say back in the 50s and 60s when, you looked at it as something heroic.
Okay. Well, we are just about out of time. I don't know if you have anything you want to add, but we have about a minute and a half left. I want to thank you both for participating. I hope everyone goes out and gets Glenn's book, Late Admissions, Confessions of a Black Conservative. I hope we covered some aspects of the book that some of the other reviewers have not been as focused on, but I think are nevertheless interesting and very, very much relevant to what's going on today and the policy debates that we're having in this country today. And I think that is another value added of what Glenn has put together here, as well as just a hell of an interesting life story that you will not doze. You will read it in a couple sittings at most. It is a page turner, as Professor Early said. So again, thank you both for your time. Thanks to the audience for joining us, and thank you for the Manhattan Institute for hosting this event. And I hope everyone has a pleasant evening.
Thank you very much, Jason, and thank you so much, Gerald.
Yes, my pleasure. My pleasure.
Okay. Good night, gentlemen.
Good night.